Hey guys, it's CECE, and today I am here to talk about my top 10 books that I want to read in 2019. It's another year, another one of these lists, and yet another year where I've lowered the number of books on this list. So, done a lot of these videos over the years, and I do in fact make it a shorter list every single year. But this year when I was creating this list, my top 10 books that I want to read, I had a very specific goal in mind. I made this list in the mindset of wanting to read and discover new voices, new experiences, new places. I wanted to make this list with the goal of reading beyond myself and of reading beyond the things that I'm used to. So, there are a lot of different interpretations of this that I have used throughout this list. Sometimes I will be talking about an age group of books that I don't normally read. I'll be talking about a lot of books by authors of marginalized backgrounds, in fact almost all of them, but I really wanted this list to emphasize all of those different voices that I wanted to talk about, and I think that this will be a good jumping off point for my reading for the entirety of 2019, beyond just this top 10 list. So with that in mind, let's talk about the top 10 books I want to read in 2019. Coming in at number 10 on this list is Beasts Made of Night by Tochi Onyebuchi. This is a Nigerian-inspired fantasy world where corrupt mages can separate a sin from a sinner, and in doing so create something called a sin beast. These are beasts that have been created by, like, feelings of guilt, specifically. This book is about a boy named Taj, who is the most skilled of the Aki, and the Aki are people who kill sin beasts, but Taj has a very unlikely and terrible consequence. Whenever he murders a sin beast, a tattoo of that beast appears on his skin, and the guilt that that beast carried now weighs on his mind. This sounds like such a fascinating fantasy world. There are so many different parts of it that I'm drawn to. I own this first book. I also own the second book, Crown of Thunder, so if I love this one, I can jump right into the sequel, and I'm really excited about this new world. It sounds so unlike anything I've ever read before. Next, I want to talk about Life is Wonderful, People Are Terrific by Meliza Banales. This book is about a queer Chicana punk girl living in San Francisco in the 1990s. It's very much about this culture of queer girls, about the mixture of that and Chicana culture. It's specifically about this girl getting a scholarship to a prestigious university and trying to make it work there, while also realizing that she doesn't have enough money to pay the bills, so she moonlights as a stripper. I think that there are like a million things that I'm interested in this book individually, but it all comes together to form this, like, fantastically interesting concept that I think is going to be dealing with so many things. I'm really excited to specifically be getting into, like, punk feminism that existed in the 90s, like third wave feminism that started happening in the 90s, and how that mixes with queer culture, with Chicana culture. There's just a ton here. Next, I want to talk about The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a book in verse, and it follows a girl named Xiomara in Harlem, and she is using slam poetry as a way to understand the various things that are happening in her life. Slam poetry becomes a way for her to understand her mother's relationship to religion and her own relationship to the world, the way that her relationship to the world has changed ever since she developed curves. This book was on so many favorites of the year lists for last year, and it has made me drawn to it despite the fact that I don't usually reach for poetry. But I'm really interested in this book, especially because I'm also anticipating Elizabeth Acevedo's new book that's coming out this year with Fire on High, so I want to read The Poet X, preferably before I get to her new book, just because it comes so highly recommended and it sounds really interesting. Moving on to a book that I want to read because I don't know if I'm gonna read it without a push. I think that I need a push to read The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. This book is on here for numerous reasons. First of all, the fact that Ursula K. Le Guin is an iconic classic author, and despite this, I've never read anything by her. It's on here because it's a classic. And without a push, I do not tend to read classics. And it's also a piece of queer classic history, and I read bits and pieces of classic queer fiction, but it can be very difficult to motivate myself to do that. This book is set on a world called Winter, and this world is inhabited by Gethians, and the Gethians have no gender. They can become male or female during each mating cycle. And then an ethnologist is sent to this world to try to learn more about the Gethians, their people, their understanding of the world. So I know that this book has a very binary understanding of gender, which I don't agree with at all. But I still think that it can be incredibly important to remember the queer stories of our past. It's why I try to read queer classic fiction at times. Plus, I want to discover a classic author whose fantasy I have never read before. And since I am reading a classic book that is dealing with ideas of gender that are, in the past, I'm also reading a couple of modern books about trans people from trans perspectives. The first of those is Small Beauty by Qing Wildon-Yang. This book is about May, a mixed-race Canadian trans woman who is dealing with the grief of having recently lost her aunt. She winds up having to move away from the big city where she has lived into a small town, and while she's there, she's very much reflecting on the grief of losing her aunt, as well as reflecting on the trans women that she has left behind. I think this book is going to be really internal and really meditating on a lot of big topics. I think this book sounds deeply up my alley and I cannot wait to read it. Next, I want to talk about When Dimple Met Rishi by Sandhya Menon. So this is a YA romance that features two Indian American teens, and it's also about arranged marriage. It has come so very highly recommended by, like, everybody. So many people adore this book, and I understand the adoration of Sandhya Menon's covers. Her book covers are glorious. So I'm really excited to read this one. I think it's gonna be a lot lighter than some of the other books that I read, but I'm also excited because I know that this features, like, a main character who's a programmer. Yeah, she's, like, an aspiring web developer, and that is also really fun. I know that that won't be, like, a huge feature of the book, but like, there are things that I'm excited about in this book beyond the central ideas, which, like, clearly I'm also interested in. Next, I want to talk about Where'd You Go Bernadette by Maria Semple. Found it. I could not remember Maria Semple's name. I picked this book up on the fly at a used bookstore for 75 cents, not knowing anything about what it was about. Now I have seen the trailer for the upcoming movie, and actually that is one of the reasons this is on the list, so that I can read it prior to the movie being released and I can go and see the movie, but also because this is, like, women's fiction, you know, negatively referred to as chick lit, which I think is an annoying term when it is used as a negative. But that is absolutely not a genre I traditionally reach for. So the fact that this is out of my comfort zone as far as genre and topic, as well as there being a movie coming out soon, this felt like it fit. It doesn't quite fit in, I think, with the rest of these stories, but it is pushing myself outside of my comfort zone, so we'll see how I feel about this one. That same day that I was at the used bookstore, I picked up Ivy Aberdeen's A Letter to the World by Ashley Herring Blake. Honestly, I just think it's funny that I made this list without remembering that I bought them at the same time, but anyway. This is on the list because I never read middle grade. Like ever. I don't read middle grade. And so I really wanted to push myself to read some middle grade that comes, like, so highly recommended. Everybody loved this book. This is about a 12-year-old named Ivy Aberdeen, and her house is destroyed by a tornado, so her whole family is displaced and she's feeling really out of place and ignored following the storm. But she is also worried because she had this notebook full of pictures of girls holding hands, and that was totally lost, and then those pictures start reappearing, being tucked into her locker, and so she winds up being kind of hopeful that maybe the girl she's crushing on at school is the one who is leaving these notes. So this book is dealing with displacement, with coming of age, while also dealing with a 12-year-old girl trying to accept her feelings that she has for girls. I really wanted to push myself to read a little bit more middle grade, so the way I'm doing that is by putting it on my must-read TBR of the year, which I hope will motivate me to read some other middle grade that I own as well. Second to last, I want to talk about Whipping Girl, a transsexual woman on sexism and the scapegoating of femininity. This book is by Julia Serano, so this has come recommended to me from a couple of sources that say it's an absolutely fabulous, fabulous book, but it is part of a push for me to read more nonfiction in 2019. I have a ton of nonfiction on my TBR. I'm constantly adding nonfiction to that Goodreads shelf, and then I just never get to it. So this is my little push to read more nonfiction in 2019 at some point. I'm going to continue to use the term transsexual because that is what Julia Serano uses. So this is described as sort of a memoir and a manifesto about Julia Serano, who is a lesbian transsexual woman with an intense background in biology. So this book is going to be debunking myths about gender and identity. It's going to be about Julia Serano and her experiences. I think it sounds absolutely fantastic, and I'm really, really excited to read it. And the final book I'm going to be talking about is Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. I have this book on my Kindle, so I really, really need to read it already. This is an urban fantasy book that takes the monsters of indigenous mythology and brings them to life. So it's set in an area that used to be a Navajo reservation, and there is some kind of great flood that brings the heroes and the monsters of Navajo legend to life, and they can walk the earth freely. And this book is about a character named Maggie who has the ability to kill these monsters. This book was one of my most anticipated releases of last year, and it's a little ridiculous I haven't gotten to it yet, especially because I already own it on my Kindle, but it sounds absolutely fantastic. It gets all of the best reviews. When it was originally being passed around, it was being described as an indigenous Mad Max, which is everything. Everything. And that is why this book is one of my top 10 must-read books of 2019. Okay guys, that is it. Those are all of the books that I wanted to talk about in this video. Are there any books that are on your TBR that are like must-reads for 2019? Let me know down in the comments below, and let me know what you thought of my choices for this top 10 TBR. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!